let's get into some of the questions in the mailbag. We know with the injuries in the outfield, Frank, that the Phillies, they're going to have to find places to fill those outfield slots, but Nick Williams has been sent down along with a few other players. So can you talk a little bit about how Nick Williams' future with the organization may or may not affect with the injuries in the outfield?
Well, I think first and foremost, the Phillies do not want to rush any of these young players. Their progress is way more important than what happens on the Major League roster in 2016. So they're going to treat those players as if nothing is going wrong at the Major League level. And whenever they're ready, they'll come up. But until then, there's absolutely no reason to rush them. And one thing that we need to think about is that their service clock starts ticking as soon as they come up. So if you rush a player to the major leagues, now you're not going to have them down the line when perhaps the Phillies will be more competitive and be competing for a championship. So you really don't want to rush Nick Williams at this time, even though you're a little bit short in the outfield.
Speaking of Nick Williams, he mentioned in an interview when he got sent down that he expects to actually be at the major league level this year. You know, the guy, he's a young kid, but he seems to have a lot of confidence in his abilities.
He does. And I think that of all the players in the Philly system, scouts tend to like his offense better than anybody else's. So we might see him later in the year. That would depend on how he's doing at AAA. I mean, if he's hitting .330 come July, well, he might have forced their hand because you get to the point where you just have nothing left to prove at AAA. So if that's the case, he might have a shot to come up. Definitely September when the rosters expand. If there's room on the 40-man roster, they can bring him up. That's another thing, too. Nick Williams isn't on the 40-man roster yet. So sending him to minor league camp does not cost the Phillies an option year. So they'll still have 3 option years left. If they bring him up in September when the rosters expand, there's no pressure to use him. And then at the same time, they're not wasting one of their minor league options that might come in handy later.
Next question from the mailbag for Frank Klose is from Kevin. Who will fill in for the Phillies in the injured outfield position?
Well, ESPN's Jason Stark just reported yesterday that the Phillies are kind of looking for an outfielder. He didn't have any specific names, but, Jason Stark, of course, very reliable name. So they might be poking around to see who's out there. But in the meantime, David Lowe has impressed pretty much this spring so far. He's done a good job with the bat. And Cedric Hunter, had a home run today already. He's somebody that could get a look in the outfield. I think that the Phillies like what they see from Hunter. They like what they see from David Lowe. And also, let's keep in mind that 2 utility players that could help the Phillies in the outfield are Darnell Sweeney, who's a switch hitter, and Darin Ruf, although he's been mainly thought of as a first base platoon with Ryan Howard. Maybe at some point, if we see Darin Ruf play some outfield this spring, I think that's an indication that they might consider using him in the outfield some this year, which could mean that the door opens for somebody like J.P. Arancibia to be a platoon first baseman with Ryan Howard. So the Phillies have some options. I know they want to keep Arancibia as AAA insurance for the catching position because they don't have any other options if Rupp or Ruiz get injured. But the cards could be played a few different ways. I think if they'll keep an eye out to see if anybody gets cut from a camp that might help them. They might grab them for the outfield. But the Phillies do have some internal options.
Frank, we know that guys like Cody Ashe and Herrera are injured. Where does that leave Tyler Goodell? He's starting today.
Goodell's probably going to play a lot. I think he's done a nice job this spring. You'll notice in some of the spring games when the subs come in the 6th inning, Goodell plays the entire game. And so far he's impressed. I mean, he was hitting .273 going into today. I think they like to give him a shot to play against the Rays organization that drafted him today. But so far he's impressed them, and he still has some things to work on. And he's a little raw, but, with the Rule 5 pick, you either keep him on the roster all year or you lose him. And I think the Phillies are going to give him every chance to play and show that he belongs in the major leagues right now. It worked out really well for them last year with Odubel Herrera, so he'll probably get that same opportunity right now while some of these prospects are developing in the minor leagues and while Aaron Altair is hurt.
Frank Klose with us here as we open up the Phillies mailbag on this Tuesday. And Frank, going back to the outfield in the Jason Stark report that you referenced, I thought an interesting name that came out of that was Jeff Francoeur, that there was a lot of internal debate about whether Frank Gore was going to come back or not, and then he kind of wanted to come back, and it was only a minor league deal that he did sign with the Braves, so maybe that could be a piece.
And we'll have to see. I mean, maybe the Braves cut him and the Phillies bring him back. But at the time, in the offseason, when they would have had to decide on Frank Gore, they expected Aaron Altair to have a big part of this season. We did not know he was going to get hurt. They expected Cody Ashley to be in the mix for an outfield position. We didn't really know that he was going to get hurt. And then besides that, you're not going to give up playing time for Odubel Herrera. You want room for the Rule 5 pick, Tyler Goodell, to have some room. And they really like Peter Borges, too. So really, he just didn't fit. Now, that certainly, the circumstances certainly have changed. And who knows if Frank Gore were to get cut by the Braves, the Phillies might, the coaches, I'm sure, who seem to like him, might poke around and say, hey, maybe you could grab Frank Gore. But that'd be kind of a long shot at this point. I mean, the value that he would bring to the Phillies, he would bring to the Braves. And although the Braves do have a pretty clogged veteran outfield, they have Ender Inciarte, who the Phillies should have kept, by the way, Rule 5 pick of 2013. I think the Phillies don't want to lose Goodell like they lost Inciarte. And then they have the likes of Michael Bourne hanging around and Nick Swisher. So he might not fit on the Braves, and at which point maybe they set him free. But until that happens, I don't think the Phillies are going to go out of their way to trade for somebody like Frank Gore. I think they're just going to wait and see who gets cut.
Frank, we got one more question from the mailbags from Alex. Which young Philly will surprise us this year?
Well, the name I picked was Brett Oberholzer for his question. So far this spring, he's looked really, really good. He's a candidate for the 5th spot in the starting rotation. But one thing to point out about him is he is out of minor league options. So the Phillies either need to keep him in the major leagues or let him go. But he's certainly pitching like he belongs in the major leagues thus far. He does have a shot at the 5th starter spot, but even if he goes into the bullpen, he could be a stabilizing force that the Phillies desperately need. Now, if I had my druthers, I would transition Vincent Velasquez to the bullpen and let him be a closer. His high velocity really keeps hitters off balance, and he kind of has the makeup of a closer. But they're giving him the opportunity to start for now. That could change along the spring if things don't go so well. And even in his outings, he seemed to be stronger at the beginning of his outings than he was later on. And he seemed to give up the hits later. But I like Oberholzer. I mean, he might steal that 5th spot in the rotation, or at the very least, he could be what calms the bullpen down.
Frank, since we're talking pitching, Aaron Nola gets the start today. I thought that Andrew Bailey might be used in the ball game today. Just your thoughts first on Aaron Nola and how he's looked this spring, and then maybe the chances of Bailey making the team.
Yeah, Nola has taken his lumps a couple times this spring, and he's given up a couple runs today, but I'm not that worried about him. Nola's pretty much a lock. And one thing you might want to consider, a couple of years ago, Cole Hamels was working on his curveball, and he said, you know what, I just threw 9 straight curveballs. So sometimes when you're guaranteed a rotation spot, you work on particular pitches, not worried about the outcome, and not trying to pitch to whoever's batting. So so Nola's pretty secure, so there might be some of him working on particular pitches at this point, because that's more important for his development going into 2016. So that's one thing to consider. Andrew Bailey, so far he's impressed. He's putting up zeros thus far, but the really important thing that the Phillies really need to decide is how well is he throwing, how's his velocity, how's his movement, how well is he locating his pitches. And ultimately, that's going to be what gives him, the nod to go ahead and get a job. So far, if it were today, I think he makes the roster no problem, especially with some question marks around David Hernandez. And Bailey was an all-star closer back in the day with the Athletics. So I think he's looking good so far. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't come north at this point. There will be a roster crunch eventually because they have a lot of pitchers competing for those bullpen spots. But if he's pitching like he does now, I think he has a real shot to make the roster.
Frank, we got a couple more minutes with you here on the Sports Bash, 97.3 ESPN. Every week, Frank posts his mailbag answers to the 97.3.com, 97.3ESPN.com website. Frank, I wanted to ask you before we let you go about, Franco and Ruf have been having really great springs. We know Franco is projected to be the starter at third base, but with Ruff's really hot spring, where does he project on the roster moving forward?
Well, I think Darin Ruf's going to be your right-handed first baseman. And the Phillies probably finally, and I've been calling for it for years, will play a straight platoon. Ruff's numbers have always been really good against left-handed pitching, and Ryan Howard traditionally has struggled against left-handed pitching. So it just seems like such a natural match to let them split the position, and you can really get a lot out of both of them. Now, for the Phillies, Ryan Howard will be moving on after this year. I think that's all but certain at this point. So what you really want to do is you want to maximize both Ruf and you want to maximize Howard. And if Howard is doing really well against righties, well, then maybe he becomes an attractive bat for a contender down the line that needs somebody to be part of a platoon. So the goal, I think, would be to put Howard in his best possible position to succeed. Ruf is the other half of that. And then it kind of works itself out. Between the platoon, you could have a nice player.
Frank, have you started to draw up an idea of how many games you think this team can win and where you think they can finish division-wise?
Well, it's funny because that question's often asked, but in some respects it just simply doesn't matter. So I haven't really tried to come up with a particular number. Do I think they'll be bad as last year? No. I think that the stability in the starting rotation that Jeremy Hellickson and Charlie Morton will bring will make the team better by a lot, because if you remember last season, they put out the likes of David Buchanan or Severino Gonzalez or Sean O'Sullivan or even Philippe Ahmad once, and Alec Asher. Just this cast of names just kept cycling through, and so many times the Phillies would give up massive amounts of runs, 6 runs in the first couple innings. Well, the next thing you know, the bullpen is a mess because they're carrying too much of the load, and then the Phillies ended up obviously with the worst record in baseball. So I think that if you recognize that there's going to be some stability, Eichhoff is a pretty solid bet, Nola's a pretty solid bet, Hellickson's a pretty solid bet, Morton's a pretty solid bet. I think they're going to win more than last season. However, the variable is, let's say they get to June or July and Hellickson and Morton are pitching pretty well. Well, then the Phillies might offer them in a trade and to successfully trade them. And then you have a new round of young guys coming up, and they might have to take their lumps, in which case, you might see a dip in the second half. But what will probably be the biggest factor with this team is how well the bullpen comes together. We don't want to see young pitchers and the young players on the team getting the letdowns from a blow up by the bullpen. So if the bullpen works out stably, they might be. It might be, I don't know, maybe 75 wins. It's not going to be a huge improvement, but it'll be enough improvement that perhaps at the end of 2016 you're going to be feeling really good going into the off season with the additions of some young players.
Frank, we'll appreciate you coming on Tuesday. Since we won't have you on Thursday because the NCAA tournament, we'll catch up with you next Tuesday with more from the mailbag.
Sounds good, guys. Have a great afternoon.
You as well. Frank Klose, you can always catch him on 97.3 ESPN.com.